To download that video, I had to click on the little button that says, terms and conditions. And do you think I read them? If I had read them, do you think I would understand them?
Maybe.
Maybe a little bit. Thank you for the faith in my ability at legalese. Maybe a little bit. Maybe I would have read through there and wouldn't have understood that paragraph. I probably would have picked up when it said, do not show this video in public. But mostly, those legalese things are in a language that I don't understand. They come from a tradition, a legal tradition, that takes a lot of time, at least 3 years of special schooling to really grasp it, which some people, they learn it and then they take advantage of that, and others, they use it to help people. If there's a problem, lawyers can fight over what that stuff means, but the rest of us, at best, just share our ill-informed ideas about constitutional law on Facebook. That's the best we do when it comes to that. But just to show you the video, I decided, for all that mess, I'm just going to click the button and hope it works out. Click the button and hope it works out. How many of you actually read those terms and conditions with your iTunes and all those other things? Susan a little bit. The Magi, the kings, the wise men, whatever you want to call them. Just some spiritual guys committed to a way of life, living out in the cultivated East, probably what we think of as Iraq now. They saw something in the sky. And do you think they just clicked the button, jumped on camels, and took off west? Maybe. Or they might have studied and prayed and considered and talked about it and made plans and consulted experts and worked out every scenario, held a goodbye party, and then they left. And we don't know the details of the story very well, much more than what Fran read from us. But you just don't pack your camel and head across the desert on a simple hunch. And whether this is a historical story or a parable story like Jesus used to tell, we don't know for sure. But my point is, whatever they saw in the sky, it was in a language that others didn't understand, but they had studied it, built on a specific tradition. It took them a long time to understand it. And certainly other people would have disagreed about what the star meant or what they were supposed to do about it. And they knew, even if their journey didn't work, they knew what they were getting into. They were kind of informed fanatics about their faith. Now, there are people of faith who will pick up a Bible and they don't read it. And if they did, they wouldn't understand it. They understand it's important, but they don't understand why. But they believe it. I don't really know what that means, but they believe it. There are people who simply click on the terms and conditions of faith with dogma, with fundamentalism, with whatever self-serving interpretation gets thrown out there, and they just hope it works out. Sometimes it does. Other times, eventually, a controversy will come up. A problem in their life will come up. And they might ask, well, what does Scripture say about that? I don't know. What does it mean? What do you mean, what does it mean? Do you really believe it that way? I wouldn't question it. Or do you just hold on to what you think it should say and ignore any challenge from people who might have significant background into what it might really mean? And people say, huh? There are other people of faith who study endlessly, and they pray about what it means, and they consider different interpretations, and they talk to people about it, and they make plans for how it'll affect their life, and they consult experts, and they sign on boldly for ways that it might grow them differently, even if they're not quite sure what it means. Sometimes it works the way they expect, other times, not so much. When a controversy, a problem comes up, these people of faith are prepared and committed to finding the truth through whatever happens in the world. And sometimes you have angry, hateful fanatics that get all the press, probably because we know there's something wrong with the way they're using that tool. But there are peaceful and loving and compassionate fanatics who follow the message of Scripture day in and day out. And those folks are the ones that we hold up and think are amazing in the world. Saints of them. And of course, there are still other people of faith who just don't care. People who come to church, they're just not interested in signing on to the beliefs or studying about them. That's okay. Maybe someday a pattern of hearing year after year the same stories and how they affect their lives might convince them of some value and beauty of Scripture, rather than the punitive boredom that most of us grow up with. I mean, we were talking about, earlier in the service, someone who's not even here right now was talking about growing up in the church and just how god-awful bored she was growing up in the church, and how the message was just angry God and people who never live up. Well, yeah, if that was the only message I knew, I wouldn't come here either. But maybe some particular days, or really every time we gather as we try to find the good news alive, I hope that we can move toward caring about the stories. But today I'm most interested in people who fall between terms and conditions and wise men. I'm most interested in people who kind of care about that thing and people who throw their whole lives at it, which is a lot of us. Somewhere between clicking on an online forum without much knowledge or concern and people who really, really want to understand what's in there. So we can move slowly toward the joy of Bethlehem and slowly toward the wisdom of ancient men and women who have shaped our tradition. Today I'm interested in us taking one step from wherever we are, all the different places, wherever we are, toward the model of the wise men, taking one step to a life guided by divine wisdom and sacred vision, taking one step away from uninformed and misunderstood hypocrisy and one step toward wonder. And that makes sense, and I never thought of it that way. So how do we take that step? I have 4 ideas. First of all, we are starting the Bible study again Tuesday at 6:45. Churches should have these things. We've had them a little bit. We've dropped off. We've had them. We've dropped off. Jack over there has been to almost all of them as we sit there, and he brings notes almost every time whenever he would come. He'd say, what does this word mean? What is this? Where's the background on this? I love that stuff. So 6:45, Gospel of Mark. We're going to learn from each other's experience. We're going to dive into the stories and their backgrounds. We're going to consider all different kinds of interpretations that we bring to the Scripture. We're going to listen to some expertise of history and archaeology and culture and languages and theology. And most of all, we're going to let those words seep into our lives. So that's the first idea. Second, if you are not a group kind of a person, then just pick the darn thing up on your own once in a while. Follow a reading plan. Or choose a book you've heard of. Psalms. Read a psalm a day. Or just flip it open and read something. It worked for Augustine. It didn't work for everybody. But I would warn, do not start on page 1 and start reading forward. You will not make it. Amen. Some people who try that, they get all the way to Numbers, which is 3rd book, and then it just what am I doing? If they get through that, maybe they get to Chronicles, and they're just confused out of belief. But the Bible was never intended, never used, in fact, to just be a book that we read like a novel. 99% of people who try that actually move farther away from grace than closer. So the book is, some would say this is the expression of God's deep and personal truth. Most of Christianity says the written word is an expression of God's deep and personal truth. It is brought together through thousands of years, dozens of people, probably hundreds of people who wrote little parts. Some are poets, some are historians, some are funny, some tell great advice, some are dramatic, some are mystical, some will challenge your deepest beliefs. It is full of weird references to itself in ways that unless we slow down and listen to our ancient men and women who've shaped this tradition, we'll never pick up on. But it is not a book. Wherever you land between terms and conditions and wise men, reading this as a book would be like putting a Band-Aid on a global pandemic. So whether you want to join the Bible study or do it on your own, just pick it up. Take it seriously. One little step toward how it might matter in your life. Third, if you don't want to read it here and you don't want to read it at home, I would invite you. Here's a great deal. Every time you come here, all you have to do is listen to it. Let it shape you. Elizabeth Escarate, who sits around there, every Sunday while she listens to the choir, practice and warm up, she flips open the Bible and reads the Scripture to kind of have an idea of what the sermon and what the whole worship is going to be about. And I'll bet, she's not here to answer this, but I'll bet that she notices that hymns and prayers have some connection. Everything I put in the worship has some slim, subtle, or significant connection to the Scripture and the message that day. It's not always obvious. It's not always relevant, but there's some connections in there. So all you have to do is listen over and over. If my sermon is very boring, I invite any of you, just as I did when I was a kid, to pick up the book and read the chapter before our Scripture and the chapter after. Do you know how many times I would be sitting in the pews and they read some pretty thing up there? Gordon Garlington would read some pretty thing up there, and I would read the chapter before it, and there were just these crazy things, awful things, violence and excitement. And I thought, what is going on here? And that question, what is going on here, has informed me being here. So, read it. Take it seriously. Fourth, whether in Bible study, at your house, in here, If you hear a scripture, my fourth piece of advice on how to let this soak into us is ask a question. If something's confusing, ask a question. If it's exciting, make a comment. I am not here to point toward any one absolute interpretation of anything at all. I have my perspectives on things. I share those. I oftentimes will give a few different. I've been criticized for giving too many different interpretations, but that's kind of who I am. But I am here to teach. In fact, that's actually my job title is teaching elder. We have ruling elders. I'm a teaching elder, just like Jesus was a rabbi. And frankly, no one ever expected me to be a pastor. I've been trained my whole life to be a professor and a teacher. So when you ask me a question, when you come up to me, as Dean has done before, as Rich has done before, as Michael's done before, as so many people have done, when you come and ask me a question about Scripture, you know what it does for me? It fulfills me. Really makes me happy about what's happening in this church and in your hearts. And it really gives me an opportunity to share all the junk that I learned back in the day that rarely has a lot of implication here. But I hope once in a while you can get a little closer to the message of God through a question. So again, no one is asking you to get on a camel and bring gold to the Son of God. But I think the wise men show us something about the commitment of truth engaged with life. We can't journey to an incarnate word, but I do think we can journey closer to our own meaning and our own purpose for life through a written word, especially as it gets negotiated through the collective wisdom of our community. What will we find? May it be love. May it be grace. May we find hope. May we be alive and find redemption. And may it draw us as light to the light. Amen.